Hey guys, and welcome back to yet another episode of In the Barn. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey. And in today's episode, we are back in the tack room, but this time looking at saddles. We wanted to find the truth about treeless saddles. Are they a reasonable alternative to a traditional saddle, or should they be avoided? And what about bareback? Is that expensive bareback pad even necessary? Okay, if you haven't done so yet already, you should go and listen to last week's episode where I shared my brand new invention for catapult that launches horse and rider cadavers over cross-country fences. That's all I can say, guys. Go and listen. If you need more information, go and listen. And don't forget to leave a review on that Apple Podcast app. Those help us be discovered by others when they're looking for a great new podcast to listen to.
We are mixing it up a little bit this week where I'm actually gonna go first, which is nerve-wracking, daunting, hopefully.
There's no rules or regulations to this. We can mix it up however we want.
There's a pattern, and you get used to the pattern. And when people mix up your pattern, man, it's like when you don't have assigned seats in the classroom or like sitting somewhere, but then someone sits in your seat that you always sit in.
I mean, even though like a lot of classes, like college, for example, you didn't have assigned seats, you had assigned seats. Like, let's be for real. You had assigned seats.
Everyone had a spot that they sat in. And when someone else would sit in your spot, you'd have to give them the dirty look and be like, I'm not happy with this.
So this week, we are talking about treeless saddles, bareback pads. Is any of this even good for our horses?
Yeah, so I kind of like went into this I was a little unsure because I've never really thought as riding bareback as potentially harmful or damaging to my horse's back. But then I've also frequently subscribed to the mentality that like if something's uncomfortable for me, then it's probably also uncomfortable for my horse. And we've all seen those horses with like really high withers or a spine that does not look particularly friendly to being ridden bareback. And like that's uncomfortable as a rider. So I can't imagine it feels any better to our horses.
Oh, agreed. Thoroughbreds, you're going to want to avoid riding those ones bareback without a pad.
If I'm in pain, I can guarantee you my horse is probably in pain. I know I shouldn't be surprised at this point, but I anticipated more research and exploration behind this topic and like the pressure of riding bareback and what's happening with a horse's back physiologically. And there was practically none, which I don't know why I was shocked, but there was like only 2 studies I could actually find that looked at the horse and how they are being affected when being ridden bareback. And one of them, I'm sorry, but I don't know if I could count this as like an actual feasible study.
Okay.
I don't know if we can count this as an actual study. It looked at the effects of physiological stress and experience of riders with high reactive and low reactive horses while riding bareback. This was published in May 2017, and their goal was essentially to compare the differences in horses' heart rate, as well as looking at the heart rate of riders, why, I don't know, while riding bareback. They had different groups that they broke these people into. None of it was the same. There was no controlled variable.
Okay, sure. Like a saddled group versus an unsaddled group.
Not even that. They had 28 horses and 28 riders, but they broke both of those groups up into 2 groups within their like subcategories. So the horses were broken down into high reactive and low reactive based on a reactivity test they conducted, which was literally them leading a horse up to an umbrella and then opening it quickly in their face and was like, yes, highly reactive. Or no, that one, not so much. How that translates to bareback? I don't know.
I don't see a connection there at all.
And they took the horses' heart rates and were like, yeah, this one highly reactive. So they broke the horses into 2 different groups, high reactive and low reactive. And then the riders, why they chose these groups, I don't know, but the riders, they divided them into 2 groups where the riders were either novice, which was those that had never ridden before, and experienced riders, which were those who had ridden for 2 to 3 years.
Huh. Okay. Novice feels like a stretch, but I guess.
But why are they who you want to use to like test on riding a horse bareback?
Wait, what was the goal of this study? Like, what were they trying to prove or not prove?
They were trying to see if different level experience of riders increased the horse's heart rate while being ridden bareback. That was it. And their conclusion was that it doesn't. But I don't think their conclusion is valid.
But I feel like, who cares? So like, I'm sorry, who cares? Like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, I would want to know riding those horses in a saddle test their heart rate, and then same rider, same horse, test their heart rate bareback. There's a study. Like, that's a thing I would want to know.
Yeah, when they were going through their discussion on it, they were talking about like higher heart rate is correlated with higher cortisol levels. So I think that's how they were equating it in their mind. But then just swab the saliva or like eye sponge, like take the horse's cortisol levels. Don't just guess at their cortisol levels based off their heart rate.
But what, bareback's unnecessary. Like, you could do that in a saddle. You could do that leading. Like, you could have a novice person lead the horse around and open umbrellas. And you could have an experienced person lead the horse around and open umbrellas. And you could...
Well, the opening umbrella was only to determine if the horses were high reactive or low reactive. That was all that was used for. And then they had the riders ride bareback around like the arena, a certain number of loops one direction, a certain number of loops the other direction. And then they measured the heart rate of each horse to determine like if they're stressed or not stressed, as well as like measuring the heart rate of the riders. And what they found was that the experienced riders had a higher heart rate than that of the novice riders, who like apparently novice riders had a lower heart rate to begin with. And then oddly enough, they actually evaluated the novice riders for a second time 3 weeks later and noted that they now had a higher heart rate than they originally did. But they never went back for a second measurement of the experienced riders.
That's really interesting because, like, why would their heart rates be different? Wouldn't, like, a new person who's never ridden before, shouldn't they be the ones who are scared? Because they're on bareback.
Oh, no.
They're bareback on a highly reactive horse. Wouldn't you be terrified?
I don't know. And then they finish it off by saying, like, horses had an unvarying heart rate regardless of the experience of rider. But, like, I don't think you can say that. Because one, they never actually break down into which horses had what heart rate. They never noted if a novice rider was on a high reactive horse or a low reactive horse. Were all the experienced riders on high reactive horses? Like, none of that was mentioned. There's way too many moving variables for this to count as like valid results. And why not use the same horse that's either high reactive or low reactive and measure them with a novice rider and then with an experienced rider? It doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. And a follow-up is like, are these all school horses? Because I'm sure a school horse has learned to tune out any emotions that their, beginner rider has versus a personal horse or a horse from, who's in a different situation, more experienced riders versus less experienced riders.
Yeah, and there was actually, I forgot, there was one other part that I think just completely throws these results out. Is the novice riders for the first test and experience, they had someone on the ground leading the horse for them. That feels like that throws off the results, right?
Right. It definitely skews the results because now you've got two people that the horse can feed off of. And I'm sure the horse knew the handler and was like, oh, I know you. This kid, I don't have to pay attention to. They're just like sat up there. I'm going to pay attention to the handler.
Right. Very confusing. I was like, this study...
Was this published? Where was this published?
This was published, let me check. Texas A&M University Library.
Oh, this might be someone's thesis?
I think it was someone's thesis. I don't know if it's been peer reviewed.
Okay, so it's a thesis, which makes a little bit more sense, but also like I hope they got a bad grade on this because this is not a very well set up test.
Yeah, their whole goal was to quantify the relationship between experience level and physiological stress of horse and rider during bareback riding session.
I guess maybe the bareback is because they're thinking like the horse and rider can feel each other more so they can have like...
Yeah, I think that's part of their reasoning was that ideally horses feed off of their riders' emotions, and horses, we've always been told horses can smell your fear. So I think it's part of that, like horses can read your body's reactions, whether you have a high heart rate, you're nervous, and then they feed off of the rider's feelings and like what's going on physiologically with the rider.
The bareback seems unnecessary. It just seems like, it wasn't set up very well. And it doesn't look like, it's not really looking at bareback. It's looking at heart rate in a specific situation.
Right. And the only reason why I bring this one up is because I saw it referenced in a few different articles that were like, bareback doesn't actually affect your horse's stress response. And like, your horse doesn't really care if you're riding bareback or not, or your level of experience is totally fine. And I was like, I don't know if you can necessarily make that conclusion based off of that study, as well as like, this was actually only like one of two studies I found that actually looked at the horse while being ridden bareback.
Which I feel like, again, looking at cortisol level, looking at heart rate, I think is important. And it is something that should be looked at, horses' stress levels, when you're using a saddle versus not a saddle, if that has any impact, because that can also be an indicator of pain or discomfort. But you have to have some structure.
Yeah, this one was just all over the place. It was a wet freaking noodle that they were just flinging at the wall, hoping for the best. So the second study I looked at that is probably one of the most popular ones out there that if you look up, is bareback good for my horse, or is riding bareback okay for my horse? It's frequently referred to. And this one was published in 2012 with one of our favorite authors, dear old Hillary Clayton.
Oh, good. She's in my, I have a study by her as well.
Yeah, this one was called Forces and Pressures on the Horse's Back During Bareback Riding. And I did not double check her math here on this one, but there was like no outrageous or crazy numbers, so I feel okay about it. But if anyone wants to go and double check her math, feel free, because she's had a few hit or misses with that.
Yes, she's not great at math.
But their goal in this study was to measure the forces and pressure profiles while riding in a conventional saddle to that of a rider riding bareback. And they did not have any bareback pad in this. It was just merely the rider's seat. And then beneath them was the pressure mats. And they did this using electronic pressure mats. They measured 7 different Arabian horses, all with the same rider, who was 125 pounds, riding in both a dressage saddle and riding bareback with a pressure mat sitting both beneath the dressage saddle as well as sitting beneath the rider's seat. And they took 4 different trials for 5 seconds each trial. So a total of 8 trials, but 5 seconds for each one, which
isn't a lot.
Is not a lot. And I actually went back and I looked at some different studies out there that use pressure mats because I wanted to get an idea, is this normal amount of trials taken? And it wasn't. Compared to other pressure mat studies, it was pretty minimal. I mean, looking at one of the Fairfax ones, they ran the horses through each setting 12 different times when they were testing out their girth, and they averaged that. So like 8 times total for each, like with all conditions combined, not that much.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's also worth noting here that they used the same dressage saddle on all 7 horses, claiming that they are all Arabs, therefore had similar back shapes and needs. And apparently they checked the fit of the saddle and deemed it appropriate for all. But like, I was a little thrown off by this comment and just kind of like...
It's a custom-made saddle that's only available to Arabs. Let me see who's the manufacturer of it.
Okay, yeah, because she was very clear that this is a saddle specifically made for Arabs. And I was like, this seems weird to...
So the saddle maker is Andy Foster or AJ Foster. These are really hard to find saddles. They're around about $2,000, but it's a custom saddle maker. And I get that like Arabs have a similar shape, like Arabs are hard to fit saddles too because they tend to be wider and narrower at the exact same time. I'll give her a pass on this one for that saddle because I do think she tried to use the best available saddle.
And I understand why she was using the same saddle because unlike the previous study I was talking about, I think she was trying to cut down on different variables. It's kind of the reason why she was also using the same rider, was that you had a consistent variables. That way you could see the changes in pressure were due to the change in lack of saddle than due to a different saddle or different rider.
Yeah. And when I look at my study, I would say that the saddle fit one horse for sure, not quite well enough. Maybe, and that it's hard. It does look like it kind of fits and it kind of doesn't fit. The foam flocking, I think, if it was wool flocking, I think the saddle could be adjusted to fit each of these horses much better than it does. There seems to be a lot of pockets and bridging, but part of that could also be atrophy of these horses. I don't know what those horses' back shapes look like.
I'm a little frustrated with her studies in that they lack a lot of pictures or just like photographic evidence or the pressure mat. I mean, they really only show one image of the pressure mats of both bareback and riding in the saddle, and I can't imagine that on every single horse it was the exact same. So it would have been cool to see the horse's back shape and then like the pressure mat to each horse, or seeing the results and the data for each horse, but that's not provided, which is a little frustrating. They only provide the averages.
Yeah, and that is something that I was thinking of when I was running through looking at mine, because I will talk about it in a minute, but I had that exact same question, is that you're making one claim, but your picture seems to show something different. So why is that?
Right, and are they just showing the averages because it skews the results in their favor? They don't have to explain this one horse that was an outlier. Like I just wish I could see the full data, because maybe they're not trying to be deceitful. Maybe it honestly was this. I would like to come to that conclusion on my own, not by someone hand feeding me their results.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into the I have some bones to pick with a couple of these online resources because I'm getting annoyed when I read a study and its conclusion is one thing, but then the media is portraying the conclusion as something different. It's really starting to frustrate me.
So getting back to this study, I know we digress a little bit, but this study, they took 7 Arabs, 1 rider, 1 dressage saddle, measured them with pressure mats in the sitting trot. And I think that's worth mentioning is they only measured the sitting trot. And I understand why, I just wish they would have expanded on it, as well as like maybe just taken the extra step.
They only had 5 seconds, Robin. There's only 5 seconds.
Right, like why only 5 seconds and why only the sitting trot? I understand why they focused primarily on the sitting trot was because obviously we've all sat the trot. We know there's a peak pressure moment when our butt comes in contact with our horse's back, and that causes a spike in pressure, which is going to be the max amount of pressure our seat is exuding on our horse's back, especially while bareback. But why only the sitting trot? How much harder would it have been to take the results of the walk, trot posting, trot sitting, and canter? I don't feel like I'm asking too much here.
No, you're not, because in the other studies I have, they're looking at multiple gaits. They're comparing walk to trot and trot to canter. They're looking at a couple other things with the treeless saddles, and there's a big difference. It does not look the same from walk, trot to canter. There's a big difference, and so it's really important to not just look at one moment, because you're not just sitting trotting on your horse. You're doing a lot more than sitting trot.
But what they found was that the surface area / contact area for the saddle was double that of the rider while bareback. So the area of contact for the saddle was 1,337 centimeters square versus 596 square centimeters while bareback, which makes sense, right? We all know the saddle has a greater surface area and disperses pressure better than that of our asses. Like, we know this. Where the saddle is bigger than our butts.
Theoretically.
They also noted that there was a concentration of pressure beneath the rider's seat bones while bareback, and that this exerted more force on the horse's epixial muscles, which is the numerous large muscles that comprise the muscles along the top of the horse's back and their top line, which once again, it makes sense. Think of someone sitting on your lap. Typically you think like, damn, you got a bony butt because their seat bones are digging into your leg. And I imagine this is probably similar to along the lines of what our horses feel along their backs if we have very bony seat bones.
Which most of us riders do.
Right. And most of us just like end up digging our seat bones into our horse's back. So it makes sense. Like all what they're saying is totally adding up, and I agree with it. They also noted that bareback was associated to have higher average pressure, higher maximal pressure, and larger area with mean pressure. And they made a point in the beginning of the study that mean pressure is the most reliable measurement, and it's more reliable than that of maximal pressure. So I think it's interesting that they focused on, at one point in their study when they were doing the discussions, bareback had higher maximal pressure when they specifically said in the beginning of the study that the mean pressure was the most reliable and what they should have been focusing at.
I mean, I guess it's good to know that it did have the max, that it did peak the highest in bareback and that it maintained, which makes sense. Like if it's going to peak the highest, probably is also, I guess maybe it's going to be the average as well.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, is that the higher maximal pressure they talk about is a peak pressure, and that peak pressure is occurring when the person is sitting the trot. So when they're talking about how high this maximal pressure is while bareback compared to the saddle, that's not the continuous pressure being exuded on the horse's back. That's not what's lasting longer than, I don't know how long you sit the trot. Like most of us don't sit the trot very long bareback because eventually it hurts and it's hurting all of us involved. Them saying that it's this much higher bareback than with the saddle, a little confusion occurs with that. So the mean total force with the saddle was 840 newtons versus 434 newtons bareback. And I believe this is when the horse was standing still. And then the mean pressure while moving was 6.3 kilopascals with the saddle versus 7.2 kilopascals bareback. They also had two more measurements where the maximal pressure was 21 kilopascals with the saddle and 50 kilopascals with bareback. And then the area with the mean pressure greater than 11 kilopascals was 11.4 with the saddle versus 63.8 bareback. And the reason they made this distinction of that greater than 11 kilopascals was that in previous published data, it has been suggested that mean pressure greater than 11 kilopascals. Also, I have no idea how much weight or pressure 11 kilopascals is. I tried figuring out in newtons.
I do. I actually know how many what the conversion to pounds. So times it by 2, it's a little bit more than times it by 2. So if you have something that's 20 kilopascals, it's 44 pounds. So 15 kilopascals is 33 pounds. 10 is 22. 8 is 17
so
pounds.
So 11 would be around 22 pounds.
A little over 22. It's probably like 25 pounds.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay. So in previous published data, it's been suggested that mean pressure greater than 11 kilopascals or somewhere around 25 pounds is a reasonable threshold to indicate risk of inducing back pain. So any results greater than this number would be worth noting and worth being aware of. Area with mean pressure greater than 11 kilopascals was 11.4 with the saddle versus 63.8 bareback, which I guess doing the math right now is about 140 pounds, which honestly makes sense. If you cut the surface area in half but maintain the same weight, of course that's going to almost double. Of course that's going to be higher because you have a smaller area with the same amount of weight. We've all taken a science class. We understand this.
Hey now, but that's Wintech's secret formula. That's why their air pads work so great. Their care pads.
They also mentioned in the study, so, the area with mean pressure greater than what's been deemed to cause or have a higher risk of inducing back pain was noted both underneath a saddle and then substantially higher while bareback. But they also made note pressure of 4.7 kilopascals, which I'm guessing would be around 10 pounds, may cause vascular occlusion, which is a fancy way of saying blood vessel blockage or restriction.
Sure.
And this prolonged can cause tissue damage. But all of their results, all the measurements taken, are all higher than this number. It's not a topic for today, but totally warrants further investigation and experiments and looking into, as well as how much greater than this, like what does it actually look like when you're applying this level of pressure to the horse's back, and what is the blood circulation looking like when this is being applied versus something of greater pressure and something of lesser pressure. Because I don't doubt it, I just want to know more.
Yeah, and those numbers, the 11 kilopascals, which is at about 25 pounds, is referenced over and over. Like that is the agreed upon number that indicates back pain is likely to occur. But I know I need to find that study and be like, wait, how did you come to this conclusion and what else? Because that's a really good point, that back pain and reduced blood flow to skin are occurring at two different pressure levels, and that you can reduce the blood flow probably fairly easily without much pressure.
I really want to go read that study. I actually did find it because most of the studies that I was reading that referenced it, they actually listed it down in their references, but it was in a different language, so I couldn't read it, couldn't understand it.
Oh, fun. I'm sure it's been translated somewhere. Everyone references it, so I'm sure we can find it somewhere.
I'm sure, but I could not find it in English, and I was like, well, I don't know if I'm ready to trust Google Translate with this one. But yeah, that was the one study that seems to be referenced over and over again. And as far as looking into what's happening to the horse while being ridden bareback, those two were the only two studies. There's also like a number of studies that look at bareback equestrian trauma. And I, of course, went into these reading expecting them to be talking about the athletes because they referred to the athletes being damaged. It turns out they were talking about the riders. And also, all the riders they talk about being injured while riding bareback are all guys. Makes sense.
Not surprised.
Not surprised at all. And one of their studies looked specifically at rodeo bareback riders. And I was like, well, yeah.
Yeah. Their bareback's a little bit different than my bareback. I don't really ride like that when
Those are my studies that I had. That was the research I had. And I think, honestly, based off of those, it looks like sitting the trot isn't great for your horse's back while bareback, but they're also measuring it without any padding in between. So I'd be interested to see what like the results with the treeless saddle say. I don't know. It's more comfortable for me when I have my bareback pad with like another pad underneath it riding bareback on my horse. And she has very high withers and an incredibly uncomfortable spine. But I imagine if I'm not in pain, she's also not in pain. And we've also been along the journey right now where apparently none of our saddles fit. So like my only option is to ride bareback. And obviously riding bareback is going to be better than with an ill-fitting saddle.
Bareback's an interesting one because, yeah, you do think about your body, like the weight being so concentrated. You can't help but think there's going to be pain involved. And so that's what a lot of the treeless studies have been looking at, is how is that weight distributed? So I definitely went into this treeless research with one opinion and came out the other end. Like the other side with a different opinion.
Oh.
I really thought treeless was like done, settled. We know the answer. We know it's not great. Don't buy treeless. Like that's really what I thought going in. And honestly, my opinion was changed a lot because there's never enough research. And the research that's out there is so like, like that's just not enough information for me, and it's not enough information to really draw a conclusion. Okay, so I decided to start my research by looking into Hillary Clayton, since she appeared in your studies and she appeared in mine, and she's been a character in a lot of episodes, so I thought it might be time to like give her a proper introduction. I did look for I did Google lawsuits and stuff just to see if she had any skeletons in her closet, and a lawsuit did come up, but it wasn't really It's not really involving her. It's involving it's involving an organization that she's part of and like probably stole from this person, but like she wasn't involved in the theft. And now this person is claiming she started the organization and now they're suing the organization. See, it's not that interesting.
Yeah, very convoluted.
It's very convoluted, and Hillary's like the president now, but had like nothing to do with it when this person invented it, that kind of thing. So Hillary M. Clayton, she has a lot of letters after her name. So her like full proper title, I think you have to say all of it when you meet her, is BVMS PhD DACV SMR MRCVS.
Is she also ASTM SEI certified?
She is! How did you know? Yes, they dropped infos on her and she passed. So she is a British veterinarian. She has her PhD. I do not know what DCV SMR is. I meant to look that up, but I do know MRCVS is the same thing Dr. Cook has, and that is the Royal, she's a surgeon, so she has surgeon credits. There's also, weirdly enough, 2 Hillary Claytons who are DMVs. The other Hillary Clayton is out of Palm Beach, and she's also a large equine veterinarian. They're about the same age. They both come from the UK, so they both are like very similar, totally different people. So make sure you're like, if you're looking up Hillary Clayton, make sure you get the right one. She's not the one in Palm Beach. So she is the president currently of Sport Horse Science LLC, Hillary. She thinks she owns Sport Horse Science LC, and it's like everywhere, including her LinkedIn page, and it's an LLC. It's an LLC, okay? I know you're like the president and the owner of your own company. It's great, but just you gotta, I bet she didn't file the paperwork, so like I really can't blame her, but it's just like, it's everywhere being quoted that she is the president of an LC, and that's not a thing. You can't be the president of an LC. Like, I guess maybe you could, I just don't know what it is. And like a lot of articles she's quoted as owning an LC, so that, I just want to point that out. It's an LLC. So the company she owns, Sport Horse Science, is something that she started in the last several years. It is an equine sports science company that basically looks to translate research findings into practical applications. So she looks at studies and applies them to things. I think the idea is that like companies are supposed to hire her and they're like, look at our product research. Is this like, do these two match? Does the research match the product we're creating? I think that's the idea. And then she also speaks about it, but like, I don't know. I got this off her LinkedIn page. If she wants to provide more information, she could. So she graduated from Glasgow University. She got her PhD and her veterinarian science degree. She was there from 68 to 78 as a student. 10 years. Just like that, that's some solid commitment to like just 10 years straight. When she was at school, at university, she was on the equestrian team and the diving team. And if you look at pictures of her, she looks like she's a diver. Like she just...
What does a diver look like? Does she just have a swim cap on all the time?
No, she's got that short, like, blonde hair. She looks like the swim coach from Gilmore Girls when, like, Luke goes to start dating April's swim coach. She has spent a lot of time as a teacher. So she's been a professor from 1975 to 2014. Her last teaching gig was at Michigan State University. For the past 40 years, she has performed research on equine biomechanics, conditioning, and rehab programs for the equine athlete. So her emphasis has really been equine biomechanics, how their bodies work, bringing them back, rehab focused. So she does dabble occasionally in, like we are going to talk about today, the saddle and bareback research. She does dabble occasionally in like the bit. She was the one that did Can a Horse Swallow in a bit. So she has published over 250 peer-reviewed manuscripts on these topics, including multiple books. I even have some of her books on my shelf. I had no idea. One of her big claims to fame, apparently, she's very, very proud of this, which is cool. It's cool. And I did like fact check her, and she seems to be absolutely right, is she was one of the first people to look into rain pressure. She was one of the first people to discover a method for measuring rein contact while riding, and then continue to do that research to figure out what's weight pressure, like how much weight you're using in your hands while riding and what impact that has on the horse. So I thought that was really cool that she was like, she is, as far as I could tell, she was the first one, I think in 2003, when she started looking into rein tension and the effects on the horse's biomechanics. She's also a dressage rider, trains through Grand Prix level. She has earned her gold, silver, and bronze medals from U.S. Dressage Federation, and she currently has 2 Lusitano geldings, which I'm super jealous of. I think Lusitanos are gorgeous and would love a couple.
Wow.
Okay, so what is a treeless saddle? Before I get into my research, because there is a lot of debate over what is a treeless saddle, what's not a treeless saddle. If you read Bob Marshall's website, he even refers to the treeless saddle police, because apparently Bob Marshall saddles are not truly treeless, but they are treeless. So Bob Marshall considers them treeless, but other people on the internet don't consider them treeless. And so they like have a joke on their website about like watching out for those treeless police. But basically, we all know that tree is the center part of the saddle. It's what the saddle is constructed around. It kind of looks it looks like the shape of the panels that run alongside your horse's gullet if you're riding in an English saddle. If you're riding in a Western saddle, it's the horn, it's the pommel. Then where the skirt would be to the cantle is all the tree. So it's the seat of the saddle, the core of the saddle is considered the tree. When you're riding in a treeless saddle, that is removed. It may be replaced with different things though. So it doesn't necessarily mean it is completely removed. Bob Marshall in their saddles, the Western saddles, they don't have bars, and the bars is what would connect the pommel to the cantle piece. So they have two individual pieces, the pommel in the front and the cantle in the back, but there's nothing in the middle. Some saddles have a fiberglass tree or something really flexible, and then other saddles just use a ton of padding and there may not be any structure in there. These saddles are well known to be used for horses that are hard to fit. They're promoted for those wide-backed horses or horses that have uneven shoulders you're just struggling to find a normal tree saddle to fit. People often seek out these saddles because they enjoy the benefits of riding bareback and they like the ability that they can feel their horse a little bit more in these saddles, though some treeless saddles are definitely easier to feel the horse in. There's also a lot of concern, though, just in general, that these saddles apply too much pressure, and that this pressure can vary from not just where the rider's sitting, but to connections such as where the girth is being attached, where the stirrup irons are being attached, that some of these locations may cause pressure points. So Hillary, we'll go back to her and her story. She did research in 2011, maybe it was 2010. She did a study, treeless versus conventional saddles, back pressure evaluated. So in this study, she wanted to again, answer the question, which of these applies more pressure? This study is kind of obnoxious as it is published multiple times in different journals. And so it looks like there's more than one study and it looks like there's a lot of research, but it's just the same study published over and over.
Oh, that's annoying.
She did this same study basically twice with the same horses, same saddle, like same everything, but claims it's two different studies, but it's not two different studies. One was done with 8 Arabs, the other was done with 7 Arabs, because they're basically the same study. So in this study, she used 2 different saddles. One was that custom-made dressage saddle we were talking about a minute ago, and then the other was a treeless saddle. So for the treeless saddle, she used an Anzer, the Carlton Anzer saddle, which is actually one of the brands I found before I even found this study, and it is a really nice. If you're going to go for treeless, I would look at the Anzer Saddleries saddles. They are actually made in Washington State. Washington State has a couple treeless saddle companies. I didn't know that. I thought that was interesting when I found that out because I live in Washington State. Their saddles are they're not like a Bob Marshall where they do have a more traditional look and feel to them. They do have a flexible tree, quote unquote tree in them that does provide a lot of the benefits of a treed saddle without actually having a tree. I don't fully understand the design. The horses, both saddles weighed about 15 pounds and they had the same rider ride each horse in the saddles. So their findings in this study were that the saddle tree was beneficial in spreading out the force. So when you look at that pressure, just like you did with the bareback studies, that saddle tree is going to distribute more pressure over a greater area than that treeless saddle. And that part of the design of the tree is to spread out that weight. They found that the treeless saddles, the weight was concentrated more in the middle third, right beneath the rider's seat bones. And that was where the highest pressure was versus the conventional saddle, which again, same thing as the bareback. The conventional saddle had a fairly even force distribution along its length, where again the treeless was very much concentrated in the middle and the front. But the treeless does get up to that 44 pounds per pressure, which is that's like 20, what was that word? kPa, what does that stand for again?
Kilopascals.
That's such a weird, whatever, kilopascals. Almost every treeless saddle got up to that 20 kilopascals, which is double what we know would cause back pain. So these horses could likely be in pain depending on how long they were ridden in these saddles. But when you're looking at this, this is just a moment. I don't know if this is walk. I don't know if this is trot. I believe they were testing at sitting trot, so I'm guessing they probably use very similar protocols to the bareback one. Their findings were that, a well-fitting treed saddle is better than a treeless saddle, which is great, but this was one saddle. It was one saddle, 8 horses. They only looked at one style. They didn't look to see if this saddle, they didn't really address its fit, not fit on the horses where they did with the conventional saddle. So I think there's a lot of questions. And she did this study twice, once with 8 horses and once with 7 horses, same saddles. So I was like, oh, good, we're done. Like, this is a great study. It seems to kind of hit home that the weight distribution in treeless saddles isn't adequate, that you need to better distribute weight. And for some reason, I was under the impression, based off of all the blogs and all the personal opinions out there, that there was more studies and they all came to the same conclusion. And that is not the truth. Hillary's study has been republished multiple times, and then she repeated it again in 2014 and came up with the same answers. But again, same saddle, probably the same horses. I don't know where she's getting all these Arabs, but same saddles, same horses. Why would your results be any different? Another study that I did find was done on Icelandic horses, and this one is also repeated a lot. And this one is one where I wasn't going to look into this study. Like, I kind of looked at it, but I was like, it's not even really looking at treeless saddles. That's sort of like, it's really actually not looking at treeless saddles at all. It's more of a bareback pad study, but they're calling it a treeless saddle, but it's not a treeless saddle, but it is. I don't know. It's more of a bareback pad. But their goal of this study was not even to really look at the saddles. It was more to look at the effects of the saddle on the horse's gaits. And again, this one is used in a lot of blogs, and the horse.com made me really angry after I read their article and then found the actual study and read the actual study myself. And I've got a big bone to pick with horse.com, which we'll get to in just a second. But I think their editors, their interviewers, you guys have to stop. You've got to stop whatever it is you're doing. You've got to stop it. So this study is called Saddle Pressure Distributions of 3 Saddles Used for Icelandic Horses and Their Effects on Ground Reaction Forces, Limb Movements, and Rider Positions at Walk and Tolt. So this study was published in 2013 in the Veterinarian Science Journal. What they did is they took 12 Icelandic ponies, 2 different riders, 3 saddles, and a treadmill, and they tacked up the ponies and had them ridden in either a dressage saddle, a traditional Icelandic saddle, which is a treed saddle. The points of the tree just go down a lot further than the points of a tree on a more traditional English saddle. And then what they refer to as a treeless cushion. But when I looked at a drawing of this treeless cushion, because there's no photo, the drawing of the treeless cushion is a bareback pad with with maybe some panels. So there's like maybe some gullet relief, which is kind of treeless, but also not really. Like, it's not compared to what Hillary was looking at. Hillary was looking at something I would consider a lot more substantial saddle-wise. So the point of this study was to determine if the rider's position and the saddle combination had an effect on the horse's ability to raise its front legs. So when an Icelandic pony is doing their little tolt thing, they want their legs the higher the better. What they found was that the cushion saddle or the treeless saddle pressure was highest under the front part of the saddle, where the saddles with the trees had more pressure in the hind end. It should be noted, though, that the rider is specifically sitting on the cantle of the saddle because that's where you sit when you are doing a tolt. So for the tolt, you want to sit further back in order to make the horses, in order to weight the hind end. It's much like a saddle seat, right? You sit further back on that saddle. So that's going to affect how weight is distributed if you're not sitting in the center of the saddle, especially if you're riding in a dressage saddle, which isn't designed to have you sitting in the back of it. So what they found was that the saddles had no influence on the horse's ability to lift its legs. So they were able, it didn't matter what saddle you were using, that the Icelandic pony could still lift its legs just as good in any of the saddles. They also found that the cushion pressure was highest under the front, but that in the middle and the back, because they broke the back into 3 spots, that it was the lowest in the middle and back. And they weren't sure why it was higher in the front than it was in the back. Maybe being higher in the front was due to the girth. They weren't sure, but it was highest around the withers, which is not the same with the Hillary Clayton study. It was found to be highest right underneath the rider's seat. But again, these riders are sitting in weird positions in these saddles.
Right. I feel like that's kind of hard to compare it to how we would normally ride, because I don't normally ride an Icelandic pony doing a tolt.
And I'll get to it in just a second. But there's some other factors going on. And when I read the conclusion of their study, their conclusion did not talk about the cushion saddle. They were actually just comparing the Icelandic and dressage saddle. They cut weird. The conclusion. They did talk about it during the the study, but their conclusion and their impact summary was not even calculating this in. Here's where my beef comes with horse.com, because they interviewed the people who did this study, one of their representatives, and the interview says one thing, and when I look at the study, I get something completely different. And they are quoting that they interviewed the researcher. And so what I'm trying to figure out is how out of context are you making these quotes? Because horse.com is often one of the first sources, along with Equus, to take a study, to interview the people, and to get it out to the public. But if you are misquoting it, what's happening is blog after blog after blog is taking the horse.com's article and sharing that information as fact. And when you look at treeless versus treed saddle specifically, resource after resource is a blog. And I'm so confused as to why it's blogs and not actual articles, and why the horse.com seems to sort of get weirder quotes that don't match the actual study. In this horse.com article, how do different saddles impact horses' movement? So this is a quote from one of the researchers. However, the study results did confirm previous research indicating that the kind of saddle does affect pressure distribution on the horse's back. Specifically, treeless saddles caused the highest pressure points and were least successful at distributing the rider's weight. In Icelandic riding populations, it's popular to use treeless saddles, which are supposed to fit all horses and allow more freedom of movement. But obviously, neither of these concepts is true. Treeless saddles cause significantly more concentrated pressure at the front of the horse's back, often directly on the withers. Meanwhile, the saddles with trees distributed pressure more evenly with a greater concentration toward the back of the horse's back. Again, the riders were sitting on the cantle. Of course, it's further back. But what I want you to do is send you a picture of pressure mats. Which of those saddles would you choose to ride your horse in? This is the pressure mat from their study.
Obviously, the last one draws my eye, but it has a lot of pressure right up near the horse's withers.
So that's the cushion. When I look at the cushion, what I see, which is what they're calling the treeless saddle.
What I see is an uneven seat bone.
Okay, I think that's fair. We may be seeing an uneven seat bone and that it's picked up. But I'm also seeing a lower, more even weight distribution along the length of the saddle, specifically at walk. That walk looks real nice to me, where I'm looking at the other saddles and I'm seeing bridging happening. I'm seeing pressure points at the withers and at the cantle. Again, the riders are sitting weird.
Agreed. The cushion clearly shows a better distribution pattern of the pressure, which is very interesting. But it's interesting as well to note that in all these pictures of the pressure matting, there seems to be a peak pressure spot right on the left side near where the horse's withers would be. And I'm wondering, is that how they're tightening them down, or is that the rider? Or is that the horse atrophy?
Is that the girth maybe? Because we know when girths are tightened repeatedly from the left side that it does cause more pressure on the left side. And this is something that we see a lot of times when we're looking at girth studies, is that the girth is going to apply more pressure on the left side of the horse because we tighten it from the left side.
It's just interesting. It's just a weird little pattern that I see erupting.
And again, this is the only pressure mat images they offered. And again, this is the averaging issue because this is the reflection of 12 horses at, going 2 different gaits in 3 different saddles. So we're only getting one image that reflects 12 horses. I'm not sure what it reflects, but I don't see the cushion as being the worst. I see it as being the best. I would choose the cushion.
I see the cushion as being the best. And it's also strange that they would quote the researchers as saying that clearly the different saddle influences the horse's movement, when in the study they said it didn't. The horse picked up their front legs the same as they did, whether it was the dressage, the Icelandic saddle, or the cushion. Oh, that's annoying. How shady.
Right. So to finish, I took a couple snaps from the study itself, which the study concludes that the dressage saddle and the Icelandic saddle were bridging. Regardless of pressure, the treeless had the highest values in the front at the walk. However, at tolt, the saddles did not differ. And I don't see that looking at this image that I sent you, this pressure matting image. I don't see that it had the highest pressure at the walk. But maybe when you average it out with the Icelandic. But then I also see on the Icelandic, there's a lot of holes. It doesn't look even. Like I can see the saddle panels perfectly on the cushion. I can't perfectly see them on the treed saddles. I'm getting a lot of pressure in other places. Why is the horse.com article saying something so different? So they found that the average pressure was lowest in the cushion at both gaits, in the mid and the hind area, and that their dressage had the highest pressure in the hind section. But again, riders were sitting funky. The cushion did not fit the horses. The cushion was too big for the horses because it was for like a full-sized horse, and it was a lot longer than desirable on a short Icelandic pony. And they only tested one cushion. This is directly from their study. There's a great variety of treeless saddles available on the market, making comparisons difficult. The treeless saddle used in this study was new and therefore still very rigid, straight, and disproportionately long compared to the short backs of the study horses. Now we've only looked at 2 treeless saddles on the market.
Yeah.
I've got one more study, but at this point we've looked at 2 saddles. We've put them on a bunch of horses, and we're misquoting our study findings. And I don't understand. This is driving me insane because this has happened. It's the horse.com that I'm constantly pulling the interview from and going, well, that's not what the study says. So what is the horse.com doing? Like, why are you interviewing these people and getting such weird quotes?
Right. And they're always within those first search results to pop up with these studies of summarizing them and putting out an article about them.
And the only reason I did this Icelandic study, because I was going to ignore it, because I was like, that's not, they were looking at the gaits, they were looking at a bunch of different stuff, but then I saw several blogs referencing this horse.com article, and I was like, wait, I read the Icelandic article, that's not what it said. And so I was like, Okay, so the last study I have, because this is the last study out there on treeless saddles, so this is it, you guys, you're getting all the research all in one place, just like the bareback. We're not missing anything. Actually, there is one study I am missing that I cannot find, but like there's some question marks on that one. So there is one more treeless study, but I can't find it. It's gone. It's been erased from the internet. And this one is titled Saddle Pressure Patterns of 3 Different Training Saddles, a Normal Tree, a Flexible Tree, and a Treeless and Thoroughbred Racehorses at Trot and Gallop. So they're looking at 2 different gaits again. So in this situation, what they did is they put a pressure pad on the horses. These were pressure pads where the rider could carry the batteries in their belt, and they could do the normal workout for 8 racehorses. So they did not do a special workout to test these saddles. They just like rotated through the saddles during these racehorses' normal training days.
Okay.
When they were looking at the pressure, they again, just like the other tests, broke the saddle pressures into the front, which is like the pommel, the middle, which is the bars, and then the hind, which is like the cantle area. So they broke those areas into 3 different pieces in order to determine where peak pressures were. So there are 3 saddles. Again, they had a normal racing saddle with a wooden tree, a treeless saddle, and then a flexible synthetic. Each horse performed the exercise protocol within the scope of the daily training sessions, and therefore different saddles were tested on different days and in random order. And in the course of the study, one horse could not be measured in the flex tree due to lameness, and a second one could not be tested due to intermittent bucking. And so he could only be analyzed at the trot because he kept bucking at the gallop. I think he was in a flex tree as well, so maybe, I mean, that's information. I feel like if your horse doesn't normally buck at the gallop and you tried a different saddle
and he started bucking, right? I feel like that's worth noting.
That's worth noting, but they like removed that horse from the study because he like couldn't. Their conclusions with this: saddles with trees do not exert critical pressure on the lower thoracic back at canter and gallop. Therefore, it can be assumed that they do not have a negative influence on the movement of this region. So one of the things this study was trying to answer was that it's important for a horse's back to be able to flex while they're galloping in order to, have some movement in their back. And they were wondering if different types of trees would restrict that ability for the back to move. And what they found was that their saddles weren't exerting enough pressure to prevent back movement. High pressure values were observed in all 3 saddles in the front at gallop and in the mid and hind at trot. I do think it's important, maybe we should consider how jockeys sit in the saddle, because they don't sit in the saddle, right? All their weight is in their stirrups, and depending on how those stirrups are attached to the saddle, they can create pressure points.
Right, yeah.
Pressures reached the threshold values that were related to back pain in other studies. So they did get over that 11. In this study, they got up to 30 kilopascals in some locations. So the saddle with the flexible tree generally showed a shift of load towards the mid and hind, resulting in a more even load distribution, although this saddle did then peak to the highest at trot. Peak pressure in the hind was nearly the same for all saddles, and this study recommends reconsidering the construction of training saddles. So the saddle with the normal tree was critical because of the tendency to cause bridging effects. So this is another study that is saying the saddle is bridging. That's again where there's peak pressure in the front and back and low pressure in the middle. So when I look at this, they have pressure mats for these horses. And again, I don't know what horses. I don't know anything other than here's what they look like in trot on average. And I think what they do is they must like overlay them somehow. I don't know how they're coming up with these, but it definitely showed that in gallop with a jockey, all the pressure was in the front to mid. There was barely any pressure in the back, but again, that would be reflective of them being in 2-point, all weight on stirrups, where in the trot, they're probably doing some posting, and the flex tree was applying more pressure in that trotting to the hind than either the traditional or the treeless. The treeless did apply the second most pressure at the trot in the hind area, where the treed saddle had a pretty even distribution at the trot. And then at the gallop, the treed saddle seemed to apply the most pressure at the withers and in the front, with the treeless in second and the flexible in third. So I would avoid flexible trees. That does not seem to be good for galloping thoroughbreds. I would say the tree's probably better for the thoroughbred, though the amount of the pressure region was a lot greater in the gallop, like the stirrup bars, whatever it is that's causing that pressure, it was a lot greater area than it in the tree saddle versus the treeless saddle. But the treeless saddle was really uneven. It was super great on the right side and not as much on the left side. So then it makes me wonder about jockeys, because it wasn't necessarily the same rider. It was the same horses. I don't know. And that's it. That's your treeless research.
Right. It feels so like we should be used to this by now, par for the course, that there's a lack of research behind just about anything. But it still always astounds me each time we hit the end of the research and you're like, that's it? That's all you got?
Yeah. So I did for the treeless, if this is something you are interested in trying, there are some rules and some tips that I was able to gather doing my research that I wasn't really aware of and that I think the general public should be aware of. The first one is you have to buy a good treeless saddle. There is a temptation to buy a treeless saddle in order to save money. Unfortunately, this isn't going to be the case. When you're buying a treeless saddle, you do still need to look for a lot of the same features of a traditional saddle. This means spine clearance, right? This means panels. This means good girth and stirrup attachments, because you don't want those areas to be applying pressure. If it's at all a possibility, some saddles do offer flocking. To buy a good treeless saddle, you're looking at about $3,000. You're not saving money by going the treeless route.
I did not know they're that expensive.
Oh, yeah. A good one. And again, that's where you're getting into trouble, is I think people want to save money. They start to cut out corners, and you're just riding in a glorified bareback pad, which isn't going to be providing any sort of weight distribution. It's not going to be designed well. It's only going to probably make your problems worse to buy a cheaper treeless saddle. So what I was finding, the Anzer saddles, which look really nice, they're about $3,000. The Bob Marshalls, which are the Western, they're like one of the most popular Western treeless saddles. They're also about $3,000. There are ones that are a little bit more affordable, around $1,000. Well-designed treeless saddle is not magic. It is not going to fit every horse, which is something that they're often advertised as, that they'll fit every horse, that hard to fit horse, it's going to be perfect for. That's not necessarily true. They still need to be fitted. You still need a saddle fitter to come out and ensure the saddle fits your horse, especially if we're talking about pressure. If you have a horse that's sensitive in their back in some areas, treeless may not be right for you. Another thing, they need proper padding. That, I think, is a huge misconception, that you can buy a treeless saddle and then use a normal saddle pad. You cannot. You actually need to be purchasing these thicker wool saddle pads that are sold specifically for treeless saddles. Those saddle pads can be about $200. So if you think you're saving money, you also have to buy a really expensive saddle pad. And because the saddles don't have the same amount of padding, this is one way that designers are looking to make up for the lack of tree and spread out and distribute that pressure.
Ha! They got you. They're still stealing our money no matter what.
They're still stealing your money. One of the things, though, I did go to one website I think that summed it up best is Stacey Westfall's blog. She posted a blog called Treeless Saddles for Horses, Pros and Cons and Things to Consider. I did read through the forum, a lot of the comments. She had tons of comments on her blog. It does seem like there's just a general saddle fit misunderstanding out there in the world, that people just don't know enough about saddle fit. They get frustrated with their saddles not fitting and then turn to a treeless and either have success or don't have success. So Stacey Westfall has a couple pros and a couple cons. And honestly, she's got 4 sentences. Actually, it's statements, they're not even sentences, and sums it up perfectly. Pros, their ultimate lightweight saddle. This is true. Once you remove that tree, in many saddles, it's a heavy wooden tree. Removing that tree saves a lot of weight. They tend to fit well on a wider, round-barreled horse. This is true, but also falls into our cons category in a second. That if the reason being is that traditional saddles, their tree points are too short for a lot of round horses and they need longer tree points. And so if you remove the tree points altogether and you go to treeless, you might have a more comfortable ride on those round sausage ponies. Cons. Some people question if it distributes the weight well enough. This is fair. This is what we were seeing in those studies. However, I think there's so many more questions here because, okay, does it distribute the weight evenly? Are you getting a better distribution of weight even though it's a higher concentration than you are in a traditional saddle? Like, I definitely have that question still. And then some people question the stability of these saddles. Do they roll? And I think if you have a sausage horse and you bought the proper padding and you're riding in a treeless saddle, yeah, you're probably adding to that roll factor because those are thick pads, and everyone knows you don't want a thick pad on a sausage pony, but that's what the saddle's designed to be used with, is with a thick pad. So I don't know how the wider horse and the thick pad and how that actually works out.
I'm gonna be straight with you. With a rotund pony, no matter what you do, you have that roll factor. Remember Daisy? We had a little pony. She was as round as could be, to the point of where our saddle sometimes would slip back, so we had to have a breast collar on, as well as would sometimes slip forward, so we had to have a crupper on. And the saddle would still move sometimes because she was just a circle.
Yeah, so that's the summary. That is, at the end of the day, those 4 things are all we know about treeless. The research just wasn't there.
I think the conclusion that I kind of came to was that while the high max pressure points and stuff seem really detrimental while bareback, especially with nothing in between your buttock and the horse's back, I would also say that those are moments in time. That's not the same pressure that's being dispersed throughout the entire ride. And I would argue that, if you have padding and you're riding in a bareback pad with a pad beneath it and you're doing that 2 to 3 times a week, you're not going to be causing probably damage to your horse's back. Now, that's not in all cases. Obviously, we have some exceptions. For most of us, I don't think we're going to be causing the damage or long-lasting. I don't know. I don't think I would be causing the damage, but maybe I just think I'm special and I'm not.
I think the other thing is, because of the locations we live in, is that a lot of people don't have access to saddle fitters. There is a big hole in the market for good quality saddle fitters that do English or Western, and that if you are someone... At the end of the day, it does appear that a treed saddle that is appropriately fit to your horse, that you can have a saddle fitter come out and regularly check, is best. But many of us probably don't have that access to a saddle fitter or the ability to pay for a saddle fitter to come out as often as they need to. So a lot of people are turning to treeless as that alternative because it only really needs to be fit once in theory, that maybe you still are spending a lot of money on a nice saddle, but that it's not going to cause the same amount of pressure points or the bridging issues that a traditional treed saddle will. So I don't know. I don't know where you end up.
I don't know. I think I started out with my research and I was a little bit confused, and I ended with a lot more confusion. No conclusive answers.
Yeah, and I started mine thinking we know everything we need to about treeless. We've studied them. We're good. We know they're bad. That the pressure distribution isn't, that isn't good. And then after going through the research, it's so we tested literally 3 saddles. That's it. 3 saddles have been tested. And it's just what is that even? That's not a fair look at the market.
I think at the end of the day, what we always say, I rhymed, I know. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. Anyways, listen to your horse, right? Because I thought both my saddles fit just fine. And I had this last week, Trin could not handle it. She took off bucking underneath both saddles, and it wasn't the woohoo, I feel good buck. It was the ow, I'm uncomfortable. And so I was going through all my tack trying to change things up and figure out what was going on, what was setting off these bucking fits. And they weren't excessive bucks. They were all little crow hops. And it wasn't until I removed both saddles and put my bareback pad on and hopped on bareback that the bucking ceased. And I realized, well, right now, bareback is going to be my better solution for riding than riding in an ill-fitting saddle. So if your horse is telling you that something is uncomfortable, that's when you make a change. And I've also been there where I've ridden her bareback and haven't had enough padding underneath my butt. Not only have I been in severe pain, she's also been like hollowing her back and saying, now I'm hurt, I'm uncomfortable. So you have to listen to your horse no matter what you're doing. You got anything to add?
No, just that horses are individuals, and what works for one horse may not work for your horse, and pay attention to your horse. They'll tell you what works for them, right? Horses are the teacher. We are the student. We just need to listen to what they say.
All right, guys, on that note, thank you so much for sticking with us throughout this entire episode. I hope you learned something and maybe you have a conclusive answer that's more clear than all of our confusion. If not, then I'm sorry you're stuck in muddy waters with us. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can reach out to us on Instagram at inthebarn.pod, or you can send us an email at inthebarnpod@gmail.com.
Yeah, let us know what you think about treeless saddles. Have you tried one? Did it work for you? Was it better or worse? Let us know.
Remember, guys, stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle, whether that's treeless or not.
Or bareback. Stay on the bareback pad.
Just stay on the horse. There we go. Stay on the equine.